beautiful statements ever made about Israel. A statement that's recited to this very day whenever a Jew enters the synagogue for the morning prayers, comes from the mouth of a Gentile false prophet named Balaam. This Balaam had apparently gained genuine revelation from God, but he also accepted their offer of payment from the king of Moab in exchange for cursing Israel. Indeed, Balaam was so eager to earn the wages of cursing that he rose up in the morning and saddled his own donkey to go with the princes of Moab who had come to him the day before to hire him. The Talmud notes that it's beneath Balaam's dignity as a prophet to saddle his own donkey, but hatred for Israel and eagerness for payment motivating. The Talmud contrasts Balaam with Abraham, who also disregards the rule of dignified conduct to rise early and saddle his own donkey, but he does so out of love, in eagerness to obey God's command to offer up Yitzhak as a burnt offering. Furthermore, the Torah says Balaam rose in the morning, but Abraham rose early in the morning. Both love and hate disregard the rule of dignified conduct, but love proves more zealous. Therefore, Abraham arises earlier than Balaam. Balaam may be especially eager, says Rabbi Resnick, because Israel seemed ripe for a curse. The book of Numbers, Bamidbar, traces numerous complaints and rebellions, culminating in Israel's refusal to enter the Promised Land and the penalty for that refusal. That generation will die in the wilderness. Paradoxically, though, Israel begins to win battles. They defeat Sihon and Og, and apparently are being blessed by God. These victories strike fear in the hearts of Israel's enemies, and particularly in the heart of Balak, the king of Moab, who hires Balaam. Balaam does not perceive the blessing upon Israel and sees only an enemy that is dangerous, but apparently vulnerable to the curse that, motivated by greed and hatred, he's ready to deliver. The heart of the story. Balaam sees well enough with his eyes, but he lacks spiritual vision. In the end, he will gain spiritual vision, but must still make a choice that each of us faces as well. With which shall we live, natural vision or spiritual vision? Balaam's blindness is apparent from the start. As he begins his journey, his donkey sees what he cannot. And I don't know how many times I have read that and just literally laughed out loud. Can you imagine if you were on the back of a donkey or a horse and it was refusing, and I've been on a horse that refused to do anything I wanted it to do, but I didn't beat it. It drove me through a creek. By golly, all the way up to my waist. I think that sucker was just getting even with me, but in the case of Balaam's donkey, he's trying to protect him. He sees God's angel standing with a sword outstretched. And 3 times, Balaam beats this poor animal. Think about being on the back of that thing, having its head turned back toward you and ask, why have you been beating me? I probably would have passed out. He is so mad that his reply is, I'm beating you because I don't have a sword. If I had a sword, I'd kill you. And this poor donkey, of course, is saving his life. Finally, Adonai opens the eyes of Balaam as well, and he sees the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed his head and fell flat on his face, which probably was worthwhile. Balaam is a seer, but his greed and hatred for Israel blind his eyes. The donkey's eyes are open all along, and she sees the angel of Adonai 3 times. But Balaam sees nothing until Adonai opens his eyes. When Balaam finally arrives at the edge of the encampment of Israel, his eyes remain open to see Israel's true condition in the sight of Hashem. And Balaam raised his eyes and saw Israel encamped according to their tribes, and the spirit of Hashem came upon him. Then he took up his oracle and said, the utterance of Balaam, son of Beor, the utterance of the man whose eyes are open, the utterance of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty, who falls down with eyes wide open. Ironically, when Balaam's eyes are open, he, the prophet for hire, can see Israel better than anyone else. At this low point in their history, while they're still wandering in the wilderness because of sin, Balaam sees the ideal Israel and first utters the words that form the opening of the daily synagogue service, how lovely are your tents, O Yaakov, your dwellings, O Yisrael. And now that his eyes are open, Balaam sees four qualities, says the rabbi, that characterize God's people despite appearances to the contrary and despite the fact that they're undeserved. From Bamidbar 24, like valleys that stretch out, like gardens by the riverside, like aloes planted by Adonai, like cedars beside the waters. He shall pour water from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. Israel is God's garden. Despite its apparent disunity and lack of direction at that time, they nevertheless possess order and they possess fruitfulness. Where the natural eye would see them wandering in the wilderness, the enlightened eye sees a watered garden, a cared for garden. Israel in the wilderness is not a mere collection of tribes that have lost their way, but they are a kingdom, and they are a kingdom that possesses power, most importantly possesses divine protection. Balaam comes to curse, but is given the vision to see that Israel is protected from the curse. Once he gains that vision, he is unable to pronounce the curse at all. Still, Balaam has a choice. The same choice we receive when we come into union with our Redeemer. Will he live by his newly gained spiritual vision, or will he return to his natural vision? And the Torah tells us that Balaam continued to seek Israel's downfall, advised the Moabites to entice Israel to sin so that they would lose God's blessing. And in the end, according to Joshua, chapter 13 and verse 22, the children of Israel slay with the sword Balaam, the son of Beor, the soothsayer. At first, a prophet. Subsequently, he becomes nothing more than a soothsayer. A prophet stands in the counsels of the Almighty. A soothsayer is no more than a fortune teller. In violation of the prohibition, by the way, of the occult practices that God has commanded, because Balaam misused his gift, he descended from prophecy to soothsaying. It's not spiritual knowledge that counts the most, but agreeing with the will of God, not so much vision as obedience to his will that gains approval.